From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Just 24 hours before Joe Biden pulled out of the race to be the next president, while he was still telling the world he would fight on, Kamala Harris put out a carefully worded tweet saying, "As vice president, I see Joe Biden when the cameras are on and when the cameras are off. In the Oval Office, in the Situation Room, and on the campaign trail. Joe Biden is a leader who fights for the American people." She didn't mention his health or energy or age, and beady-eyed watchers were quick to notice the picture attached to the tweet. Curiously, it showed Harris in a bright suit and high heels, walking and talking, young and vital, while Biden is stood still, listening intently to her advice. And just above him, it showed a portrait of an American president that history has chosen to forget. Franklin Pierce, a Democrat who became the first sitting president whose party wouldn't back him to run again. 24 hours later, that picture perfectly captured a moment in American history. Joe Biden is out of the race. He's throwing his weight behind his vice president. Just 4 years ago, this was Kamala Harris calling Biden to celebrate their win.
We did it, Joe. You're gonna be the next president of the United States.
4 years on, can she do it again without him? The story today: can Kamala Harris beat Donald Trump? Josh, this feels like a real throwback to 4 years ago when we were talking to you on the podcast almost every week about the run-up to the last American election. We talked to you last week about the Republican nomination for a vice president, and now it feels like history is changing all over again. Just reintroduce yourself to our listeners, remind them who you are and what you're doing now.
So I'm Josh Glancy. My current day job is editing news review at the Sunday Times. But I did spend 5 years in New York and Washington covering the Trump era and 2 presidential elections there. So I have quite a lot of memories of all the various players who are actually involved at the moment, from Biden to J.D. Vance to Kamala Harris. And yeah, it feels at the moment a bit like the news cycle has taken a speedball or something.
It feels like every week is a season finale. I can't wait for it to calm down.
I mean, yeah, we were joking in the newsroom. There's last Saturday night, people stayed till kind of 3 a.m. to cover the Trump assassination attempt. And we thought, God, if Biden resigns Saturday afternoon, no one's ever going to sleep again. So he very generously waited until Sunday.
Well, tell me about that moment, because I know you will have been following the news. What did you make of it?
Well, like a good metropolitan Liberal, I was walking on Hampstead Heath at the time. Annoyingly, it's quite bad reception. So I kept getting these sporadic messages saying just like Biden ! And I actually rushed home because, well, partly I wanted to update my column so they could republish it. But also I felt from the moment we saw that debate, this moment would come. But it's one thing to feel that and another thing to actually see that statement. And it dropped on X, Twitter. I mean, I don't think a lot of his closest aides knew that was happening. So it really was quite a jaw-dropping moment, I thought.
Hugely. And as you say, aides didn't know it was happening. We know that 8 minutes later, an email was sent out from both Biden and Kamala Harris asking for donations. It feels like backstage, everyone was not prepped. You said all of this seemed inevitable after that debate when he came up against Trump and just looked quite weak and old. Since then, what has his vice president, what has Kamala Harris been saying out loud, and what has she been doing behind the scenes?
Well, publicly, she has been very loyal, as you would expect her to be. And she did a wash-up after that debate, attempting to plug some of the damage that had been done. You know, she told us that Biden was still very active and vigorous and still on top of his game. And that is going to come to hurt her now if she does end up running against Trump, because they are already accusing her of having covered up for Biden. So questions will be asked about that. But privately, I think she knew that it was a game changer and that there was the chances of him dropping out greatly increased. And so she has been building support, talking to people very delicately, lining up supporters in the party. Over half the Democratic politicians in Congress, I think, have now already endorsed her. So she was ready to roll, I think it's fair to say. And, you know, I wouldn't hold that against her. You know, I think she played a careful game, and that was the right thing to do.
And Biden very promptly, after shocking everyone with his pulling out, very promptly endorsed her. How much does that mean? And does this mean we're now looking at a coronation, or is there still a process to go? Could there still be another candidate coming in?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the Biden endorsement is massive. It puts the weight of the White House behind her. It's a massive flair to all mainstream Democratic politicians. This is our candidate. It's going to scare off the competition. And you've seen that already. People like Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who have been touted as possible competitors, have already basically rode in behind her. It's also a signal to donors and fundraisers, this is our girl. And so it's a pretty big deal. It's hard to see, it's not impossible, but it's hard to see how anyone will be able to mount a serious challenge to her at this point.
And we've seen millions of dollars flooding in since she was announced as Biden's favourite for the role.
Yeah, we have. I mean, a lot of it grassroots money. I think the Biden announcement, it was a catharsis. It was a moment of catharsis because it's been this pressure cooker building up. Will he go? When will he go? There was a lot of pent-up emotion and seemingly investment in the Democratic cause. So I think there was a moment of emotional release for a lot of people.
And Josh, Kamala Harris has obviously been vice president for 4 years. We've seen her in the public eye. But just take us back. Remind us a bit about her background. What do we know about how she grew up?
Well, she's quite an interesting character, really. I mean, she's in some ways dare I say, a product of the British Empire, in the sense that her mother was born in Madras, now Chennai. Her father was born in Jamaica. They both came to America. Her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, was a biomedical scientist. And then her father, Donald, was an economist, very interested in development economics, quite on the left. I mean, I think he was described as a Marxist scholar at one point. And they mostly grew up in California. She then went to Howard University, which is a historical black college in Washington, D.C. She married quite late. She doesn't have her own kids. She's got 2 stepkids with Doug Emhoff, who is a Jewish, quite high-powered lawyer. And it's a love story. They will tell everyone to sort of slightly sickening degree. He's your classic, what they call wife guy. You know, he loves celebrating his wife. I don't mean to sound too cynical. I think he genuinely does, but it can be a bit emetic at times. But they are a sweet couple, and they're a sort of advert for, she was a career person, rose very high as a prosecutor in California, but fell in love later in life. And they are quite sweet together.
He says grudgingly.
Yeah.
Who needs a political love story? So we know she's doing very well, has this very high-powered role as a prosecutor, as an attorney in California. How does she end up in politics?
Well, it's quite a well-trodden route, that, isn't it, in American politics as a public prosecutor. She was then district attorney for San Francisco and then became attorney general for California. I think she's always been a good operator. The Democratic Party in California is effectively a one-party state. So your job there is to get on with the power brokers, the insiders, and she's always been quite good at that. I think her heritage and her racial identity has always carried a lot of symbolic weight. She's quite charismatic. She likes a laugh. You know, she's been an effective operator in Californian politics, and she ended up being the senator for California in 2017. And then the big question for her was, can you make it on the national stage? So she ran for president in 2020 in the Democratic primary.
I mean, that happened quite soon after she becomes a senator. This is only 3 years later. She goes for the top job.
Yeah.
That's probably when most of us became aware of her. I mean, I remember her suddenly popping up. Just take us back to that campaign, though, because it was quite memorable.
Yeah, so she ran in the primary, which I covered at the time. And initially I thought, wow, she's going to be a really top-tier candidate. You know, she looks the part. She's got a lot of fundraising behind her.
Was she a good performer on stage when you saw her?
No, she was terrible.
Oh.
and she really shriveled on the big stage. She was wooden. She was inauthentic. It wasn't quite clear what her message was, what she really believed. I mean, the only moment that anyone really remembers from that campaign where she did score a point was when she really, really hammered Joe Biden in a debate. He used to oppose the busing of young black kids to segregated schools. And she pointed out that I was one of those children whose busing you opposed.
What I opposed is busing ordered by the Department of Education. That's what I opposed.
Well, there was a failure of states to integrate public schools in America. I was part of the second class to integrate Berkeley, California public schools almost 2 decades after Brown v. Board of Education.
Because your city council made that decision. It was a local decision. So that's where the federal government must step in. That's why we have the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. That's why we need...
And that landed a real blow on Biden. He was furious about it. Apart from that, however, there were tales of chaos and mismanagement inside her campaign. No one ever seems to like working for her very much. The donors fled after a while. Her polling never really got off the ground. She just wasn't very good. I mean, she was out of the race by November 2019, so she didn't even make it into the calendar year of 2020. And yet, a few months later, she was a vice president.
Which is quite surprising, given how vitriolic she'd been about Biden and how upset he'd been at that. How did that happen?
So there was definitely a couple of things in her favour. She'd been friends with Beau Biden, Joe Biden's son, who's no longer alive, and that meant a lot. And she also, again, has that incredible symbolic power. You know, we'll take you back to 2020. It was the aftermath of George Floyd. Having a black woman or a woman of colour as your vice president, it meant a huge amount. And she was greatly celebrated, you know, as a shatterer of glass ceilings. And that was a big moment. But she then struggled somewhat in office, at least early on.
So, Josh, you've described this meteoric rise. She very quickly becomes vice president, having really only entered politics a few years earlier. Talk us through how she did in the job.
It's a difficult job being vice president. You have lots of fanfare and very little power. And like many before her, she struggled. She struggled to define herself. She struggled to project herself in the way she wanted. She was given a nightmarish brief of trying to do something about immigration on the southern border, which has been a running sore in Biden's administration. But she didn't do a great job with it. Don't come was her sort of tagline. There wasn't really a sort of substantial attempt to implement any policy on this. She at one point was questioned about why she hadn't been to Guatemala and some of these places to try and flesh out her policy. And she said, well, I haven't been to Europe either.
We've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I mean, I don't understand the point that you're making. I'm not discounting the importance of the border.
Which was a pretty weird answer.
I'm not sure that helps.
Well, no, it didn't help, but it wasn't really relevant. And she
also doesn't make it very statesmanlike.
She floundered, frankly. And to be honest, there have been certain policies that have been implemented on immigration later on in the Biden administration, haven't really had her imprimatur on them, and she hasn't really been involved in the issue. So she really struggled. I would say until last year, a turning point for her was the repealing of the Roe v. Wade legislation that federally mandates abortion. Huge moment in democratic politics, in liberal politics, in American history. And she, as a woman and as vice president, was able to take the lead on that in a way that Joe Biden just couldn't have done. And she's been quite active in going around the country, talking about abortion, why it matters. And that has been an issue that the Democrats have really benefited from politically. So I think that was finally something she was able to get her teeth into. But she is not a hugely effective political communicator. She doesn't poll well and has had low favourability ratings throughout her presidency, lower than Biden and Trump for the most part. So she's not a shoo-in to win an election if she does get the nomination.
Well, we'll come back to the polling in a moment. Before we do, you mentioned Roe versus Wade being a moment where she came into her own. And many people have said that could be, abortion rights could be the issue that changes the election. And she would be fronting that if she does become the candidate. What are her other strengths if she was to become the Democratic nominee?
Well, age certainly helps. I mean, the ability to have good recall of policy and finish her sentences effectively, I'm afraid to say, is that we were in a position with Biden where he wasn't able to do that. So she's 59, and then suddenly the age conversation is about Trump's age. He's 78, and he does ramble, and he's not always coherent. Now, that's somewhat priced in with Trump because he's quite a sui generis character. But you saw last night, Democrats were already pivoting to, well, he's the old candidate. So that's already given them, a complete 180 on that issue.
Mm. I think it was Nikki Haley a couple of months ago who said the first party to ditch their 80-plus-year-old candidate would be the one that won.
Yeah, totally. We'll see if that comes true. But certainly they can now present themselves as the campaign of the American future, of youth, of vigour, of energy. That's going to help a lot. And it might revive, as we saw with the donations, it revives a bit of enthusiasm among what was a sort of slightly desperate Democratic base. Other assets she has, she's going to need to prove to America that she's moderate. People will make assumptions about her being very left-wing. So she was quite a tough prosecutor in California. The left aren't going to love it, but I think she's going to have to play that up, talk about her record of being tough on crime. But beyond that, it's not really clear what is the Kamala Harris program. She's going to have to distinguish herself from Biden a bit. We're going to keep hearing, well, did you cover up for Joe? So she's going to have good answers on that, which is going to be difficult because I think the truth is she probably did a bit.
Did you know how old?
Yeah, how much did she know and when did she know it? Well, she was seeing him for lunch every week for an hour, so probably quite a lot.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how the campaign develops. But the big thing is people are now going to be looking at her as a future president, not as a number two. And just that is a very different way of assessing someone. So the speeches she gives are going to be assessed in a new light. It'll be really interesting to see how America responds to her as a potential president in waiting.
There will be more scrutiny of her and everything she says. There is also, as you say, almost as a new momentum we hadn't seen with her before, where the whole of the party, lots of people within the party are piling in behind her, raving about her skills. Not everyone, though. President Obama has been quite restrained in what he said, and also some members of the Democrats were very critical in the last few weeks. Just give us a sense of that, and what are they all saying now?
Obama's played a fascinating role in this whole saga. He's clearly been quite instrumental in ushering Joe Biden to the door, although they have quite a sort of fierce antagonism now at this point between them, so it's quite complicated. But I think Obama didn't want it to just seem like a coronation. I think he knows that the optics of that are bad. If you're a Democratic voter, you've been told, Joe's fine, we're ready to go, Joe's going to be the nominee. And now you're being told, actually, Joe's not up to it. Here's your new nominee. It's Kamala. And I think there will be Democratic voters who think, well, hang on, are we going to have a debate about this? Are we going to...
Well, and lots of Republicans.
Yeah.
Who've always pointed the finger and said, that's the secret plot.
Right. It is just sort of politics by establishment decision-making. So I think Obama rightly doesn't want to see it as a pure coronation. I think Nancy Pelosi, who's also been very central in all of this, former Speaker of the House, also has held back from saying it should be Kamala. Obviously, they'll row in behind her if she gets a nomination, as we expect she will. But I think they're just holding back a little bit because they just don't want it to look like it's a stitch-up.
Yeah. Some have been sort of actively saying it mustn't be her in the last few weeks. Tell us about that.
There are quite a few people who will look at her favourability ratings and look at her performances in the primary in 2020 and think, this is not necessarily the right person for us. There will also be, and this isn't ever said explicitly, but there are obviously concerns that America's never had a female president. It's only ever had one black president.
Is it ready for a woman of colour?
Yeah. That's a valid concern. Even if you think it should be, which I think we could probably all agree on.
Yeah, it's just, is it?
Is it? And to drill down into the political reality of that, can she win Pennsylvania? A lot will come down to that. Can she win Michigan? And that means certain voters, you bring them into your camp, moderates, swing voters in districts of those states. It's an open question.
You said earlier that a lot of the people who could have stood against her have now come out declaring that they won't and backing her. Is there anyone left who might still throw their hat in the ring?
Not in the top tier. There's a Joe Manchin of West Virginia, who's currently an independent senator, has talked about coming in, but he really is not in the mainstream of the Democratic Party. He's quite far to the right. At the moment, I can't see anyone, but they still have time to launch an insurgency.
In that case, does her ability to win when it comes to an election, does it all come down to who she chooses as a VP?
Well, the VP choice is obviously going to be important. I mean, there's been lots of jokes and memes going around at the moment that, it's going to be the whitest person in America.
There's lots of wine lists doing
lots
around.
Of wine, yes, lots of it'll be a sort of Chardonnay choice. But in the same way that Barack Obama chose Joe Biden, who sort of embodies a certain type of whiteness, I don't mean that in a pejorative way, I suspect it will be a white man. I've seen some people saying, she should choose Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and, it'll be two tough women going together. But I suspect Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania is the favourite.
Pennsylvania has a lot of votes.
It does. It's also just, it represents something important in American politics. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, he performed quite well in the aftermath of the assassination attempt on Trump, which was obviously in Butler, Pennsylvania, and he reached out quite effectively to the family of the man who was killed in the shooting. And yeah, I would say that works, although Shapiro is Jewish, so she might want to go even more sort of white sliced bread than that, in which case there's Andy Beshear of Kentucky or Roy Cooper of North Carolina. I mean, these names are being thrown out. There will clearly be a conversation going on about who might work best. You also need a bit of personal chemistry, ideally, so we'll see.
It is fascinating and bizarre to think about how you can make your ticket seem more waspy, basically, in America.
Yeah, but the truth is, if your career has partly been about the symbolism of what you represent, then you have to think about
how you balance it out.
Yeah, that's the sort of politics in any country, but particularly a country as racially segregated as America still is.
And in terms of polling, we obviously haven't had very much yet with Kamala Harris as a potential nominee. We've only ever sort of polled her as a VP in the past, as a potential nominee, and something does change when you become the person. There is a huge momentum. But how is she polling, and is there a path to victory for her?
She polls basically the same as Biden against Trump. Very slightly better. I think she's 2 points behind nationally. But I just don't think any of these numbers really mean anything until people have had another look at her as a potential president. But, we've always got to remember Trump is not popular outside of his devotional base. A lot of people just don't want to go around in the ring with this guy again. They're worried about the instability that comes with Trump, the chaos. And as we talked about abortion earlier, I mean, the Trump ticket is him and J.D. Vance. It's quite a hard MAGA ticket. It's quite unapologetically ideological, populist, nationalist. There will be what we call wine mums in the suburbs of places like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh.
The idea of wine mums.
It's a thing in American politics, but there will be moderate women in the suburbs of those big cities and the commuter towns who will look at Trump and Vance and think, well, they're a bit hardcore.
And Pennsylvania is one of those key swing states. We're told this election, it'll come down to a handful of key states that will decide it.
Yeah, it will, particularly as Democrats have been struggling in Michigan, partly as a result of Gaza and other things. So there will be some political hay to be made among people who look at Trump and Vance and think, that's a bit much for me.
And Josh, just finally, you've been America correspondent. You've watched one of these elections play out before. Do you think she'll do it? Do you think she'll beat Donald Trump?
I think she's got a shot. She's got a shot. I don't think if she did win, she'd be a great president, but she's got a shot and she could probably do okay. That's my very enthusiastic answer.
Resounding there.
Yeah. That's the sort of tepid truth.
That was Josh Glancy, news review editor at the Sunday Times. Today's producers were Sam Chantrasak and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Ford. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. We have rolling coverage of the American elections and all the latest in the Democrat and Republican camps online at thetimes.com and on Times Radio. Do leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. And if you'd like to get in touch, drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.